What if an ancient warning wasn't just recorded in history, but intentionally preserved for the very generation living today, a message not delivered by respected leaders or religious elites, but whispered through the life of a man the world never expected to carry divine authority? Amos was no king, no priest, no scholar. He was a caretaker of animals, a gatherer of fruit, a man whose life seemed too ordinary to hold anything extraordinary. Yet God entrusted him with a revelation sharp enough to expose corruption, awaken the complacent, and shake the foundations of an entire nation. The people ignored him then, and the devastation that followed proved every word true. And now, the uncomfortable question echoes again. What if the same spiritual deafness that silenced his warnings is echoing in our world today? What if the stirring you feel inside, the tension, the pull, the strange sense of spiritual urgency isn't random at all, but the same divine prompting that once lifted a simple shepherd to confront a sleeping nation? If this message resonates in your spirit, comment 777 as a declaration that you're listening, awakening, and aligning yourself with God's voice in this moment. And to everyone who has supported this journey through Super, thanks. You're not just backing content, you're helping resurrect voices history tried to bury. Because the message of Amos isn't dead scripture, it's living truth. And the shift you've been sensing may be the beginning of something holy, urgent, and completely unseen. Stay watchful. The silence is about to break. What Amos warned that nobody listened to, shocking biblical truth. Tekoa was nothing more than a forgotten speck on Judah's map, an overlooked patch of land where life moved slowly, predictably, and without spectacle. Yet beneath its quiet surface lay a kind of rugged poetry, hills that glowed like embers under the relentless sun, open fields that breathed in long, weary sighs, and fig trees that seemed to hum their own ancient melodies in the afternoon heat. In this uncelebrated corner of the world, where shepherds shaped their days around the rhythm of animals and seasons rather than thrones or cities, a boy named Amos grew in obscurity, carrying no hint of destiny except the patience carved into him by the land itself. While other children dreamed of marketplaces or distant kingdoms, Amos walked the same worn paths each morning, guiding sheep across unforgiving terrain, sharpening his senses on the quiet threats that hid in rustling grass, and tending to stubborn sycamore figs that demanded a craftsman's timing more than a farmer's strength. He learned to watch closely, to listen deeply, to understand the subtle shifts of nature and time, a discipline no one recognized as spiritual training. But heaven did. To outsiders, he was merely another rural laborer with calloused hands and dust-stained clothes, someone far removed from the noise of temples and politics, far beneath the notice of the powerful. Yet beneath that plain exterior flickered an unspoken tension, an awareness of a world unraveling in ways he could not name. When passing travelers spoke of Samaria's wealth, its polished elites, its towering confidence, Amos heard more than stories. He heard the fractures beneath the shine, the cries of the oppressed smothered by the laughter of the satisfied, the moral decay hidden behind prosperity's mask. Something righteous stirred inside him, not anger, but a burning clarity that injustice was spreading like a shadow across the land. He never voiced it. He didn't need to. The weight grew on its own, quiet but relentless, like a storm gathering behind the horizon. And though he had no prophetic credentials, no lineage, no temple education, something eternal had already begun pressing against his spirit. God was shaping him not through visions or miracles, but through silence, discipline, and a growing ache for justice. Long before Amos understood what was happening, the call had already begun, not in thunder, but in burden, not in speech, but in the heaviness of seeing what others refused to see. And when that divine pressure finally broke open, it would not bring comfort or reassurance, but a truth sharp enough to confront kings, expose corruption, and shake a nation that had mistaken prosperity for righteousness. That day began with the same quiet breath as every other sunlight spilling gently over Tekoa's hills, warming the earth in soft tones of gold while Amos guided his flock along paths worn smooth by years of repetition. The sheep moved in their usual calm procession, The wind carried its familiar scent of dust and fig leaves, and the valley hummed with the muted life of another ordinary morning. Yet beneath that peaceful surface, that something ancient and powerful had already awakened. Before the sun completed its journey across the sky, the life Amos thought he understood would be completely rewritten. Standing alone among the hills, eyes scanning the grazing sheep, he felt it the subtle but undeniable shift. No vision appeared before him, no thunder split the sky, yet a presence descended with a gravity that stole his breath. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. A heat rose quietly through his body, as though something long dormant had been set ablaze. Even the wind behaved differently, no longer drifting aimlessly but moving with intention, pressing against him as if carrying the weight of an unsaid command. In that unbroken stillness, Amos realized this was not imagination but a summons subtle, irresistible, divine. He had never imagined himself destined for anything beyond the fields he tended or the figs he cut open with careful hands. But now, in the silence that had shaped him, a voice emerged, gentle as a spark, fierce as judgment, and he suddenly understood the God who formed galaxies had chosen him for a mission he had never asked for and could never refuse. He was being sent north, into the very heart of Israel, not to comfort the nation, but to confront it. His message would not soothe, it would wound. He would stand before rulers, priests, and elites who bathed themselves in luxury while the cries of the poor were smothered beneath their excess. No one would celebrate him. Many would despise him. But heaven's verdict was firm: corruption would be exposed, and the shield of prosperity would no longer protect the guilty. Who was Amos to carry such a burden? Not a prophet by lineage, not a scholar, not a temple voice, merely a shepherd with weathered hands and a spirit trained by solitude. And though everything in him could have longed to retreat, to shrink from the magnitude of what he was being called into, obedience pushed him forward, for to refuse the call would be to reject the very purpose for which his life had been silently shaped. And so he turned from the hills of Tekoa, leaving behind the familiar rhythm of sheep and figs, and began the long journey north. Israel, a kingdom shining on the outside but decaying within, waited for him, and Amos walked toward it, carrying a message that would crash upon its false peace like the first crack of approaching thunder. The road toward the kingdom of Israel stretched endlessly before Amos, a ribbon of dust and heat winding through valleys that breathed with silence and hills that watched like ancient sentinels. He walked it alone, carrying nothing but a weathered staff, the endurance forged from years among sheep and fig trees, and the burning weight of a divine summons he dared not resist. He had no scrolls tucked under his arm, no grand strategy or polished rhetoric, only obedience, and a message forming within him like thunder still trapped inside the clouds. As he drew near the borders of Israel, the whispered rumors he had heard in Tekoa began to take on a darker clarity. Israel sparkled with prosperity, its cities buzzed with trade, palaces reflected sunlight like polished mirrors, and festivals filled the air with music and intoxication. On the surface, it looked as though God himself had poured gold over the land. But Amos was a man trained by the subtleties of nature, a reader of skies and seasons, someone who knew when beauty masked decay. Even before crossing fully into Samaria, he sensed the imbalance. The brightness felt forced, the celebrations too feverish, the abundance too perfectly displayed. It was the gleam of a kingdom trying to blind itself from its own rot. Upon entering Samaria, the illusion expanded. Wealth saturated the streets. Nobles paraded in garments woven with threads of luxury. Market stalls overflowed with spices, silver, and fabrics glimmering like captured sunlight. Wine flowed endlessly from balconies where the elite reclined in comfort, and the temples, lavish in structure and performance, echoed with rehearsed devotion. To an untrained eye, it looked like divine favor, but Amos saw the shadow behind the spectacle. Slipping into the narrower passages of the city, he stepped into Samaria's hidden reality. Families crouched behind walls of prosperity they would never touch. Laborers with hollow cheeks dragged their bodies through endless shifts to sustain the indulgence of others. Slaves bent under burdens heavier than their own names. Children wandered barefoot, watching carts stacked with goods they were never allowed to taste. It was more than inequality. It was the deliberate machinery of injustice. Justice itself had been bought and chained, no longer a flowing river but a reservoir hoarded by the powerful. The priesthood, dressed in beauty, had surrendered truth for comfort. Worship had become theater. Offerings replaced obedience. The altars burned brightly, but the hearts behind them were cold. Amos saw the great reversal immediately, the powerless crushed, the powerful insulated, the nation far from God yet pretending nothing had changed. As he walked through Samaria's broad avenues and cramped alleys, his feet moved from decadence to deprivation, from feasts to famine, from temple choirs rehearsing with precision to widows muffling the cries of hungry children. Yet beneath every sound, market clamor, wine-soaked laughter, temple songs, he detected another frequency, a spiritual groaning that throbbed beneath the surface like an unhealed wound. And in that moment, the truth crystallized. The message Amos carried would not simply challenge Israel. It would slice through its illusions like a blade drawn across silk. It would be unwelcome. It would be fought. It would provoke those determined to remain blind. But the fire within him refused to be silenced. And before he even realized, the moment had come. Standing amid Samaria's glittering chaos, Amos felt something rise. He opened his mouth not in anger, not in ambition, but in obedience, and when he spoke, the sound carried with the force of a storm breaking open the sky. He opened his mouth, and the first words that tore out were like a shockwave through the streets. "The Lord will roar from Zion, and his voice will thunder from Jerusalem." It wasn't an introduction, it was an eruption, a spiritual detonation that cracked through the noise of daily life. Conversations faltered, footsteps halted, faces turned instinctively toward the shepherd-looking stranger whose presence felt far too heavy for a man dressed in rough cloth. He held no credentials, no scrolls, no robes, and yet the air itself seemed to gather around his voice as though heaven was amplifying every syllable. At first, he spoke of the nations surrounding Israel, naming them one by one like a judge calling defendants into a courtroom. Damascus, Gaza, Tyre, Edom, Ammon, Moab, each condemned for their violence, their cruelty, their calculated betrayal of righteousness. Israel's onlookers listened with growing eagerness, even pride. Finally, someone was declaring justice against their enemies. Finally, a prophet who spoke what they wanted to hear. But then Amos shifted not in volume, but in direction. The tone darkened, the spiritual pressure in the air tightened, and suddenly, the lion's roar that had been aimed outward turned inward. Israel became the target. He accused those who reclined on ivory couches while the poor starved beneath their feet. He exposed judges who traded verdicts like merchants haggling in a market, priests who transformed worship into a money-making show, leaders who converted justice into a luxury only the wealthy could afford. Then came the words that felt like a blade dragged slowly across the facade of the nation. "You who trample the poor and demand their grain. You have built houses of cut stone, yet you will never live in them. You have planted beautiful vineyards, yet you will not taste their wine." The crowd stiffened at each sentence, as if the ground itself had shifted beneath them. Amos wasn't uncovering hidden scandals. He was declaring the truths everyone had quietly learned to ignore. His words cut through the excuses, the blind optimism, the religious performances slicing straight to the rot beneath the surface. And the force behind his voice wasn't eloquence. It was something older, greater, uncontainable, in authority that bypassed intellect and struck directly at conscience. Some listeners exchanged tense glances. Others looked away, pretending disinterest. A few scoffed under their breath, desperate to reduce the moment to theatrics. But Amos didn't waver. His voice didn't crack. His gaze didn't soften. He hadn't come for approval. He hadn't come for acceptance. He had come to deliver a verdict from the one who could no longer be ignored. As the echo of Amos's declaration still vibrated through the courtyards of Samaria and drifted beneath the towering gates of the temple, something even more unsettling began to rise within him. The words he had spoken were merely the doorway. What came next was revelation raw, unfiltered, and impossible to dismiss. Heaven did not continue with speech. It unveiled its warning through visions, opening the unseen realm before Amos, as though tearing through the fabric between earth and eternity. The first vision struck without warning, a landscape of flourishing fields spread before him, green with promise, shimmering under the sun like a land blessed beyond measure. But the beauty shattered as a swarm of locusts descended, a living darkness that devoured everything alive. What moments before had been abundance became desolation, stalks severed, grain erased, hope extinguished. The meaning was unmistakable, and the weight of it crushed Amos's spirit. This was Israel's future if they refused to turn. Compassion surged through him, overwhelming even the severity of his message, and he cried out, "Lord God, forgive, I beg you. Jacob is too small, he cannot survive this." Yet the visions pressed on. Suddenly, fire appeared primordial, consuming, relentless. It swept across the land like a divine storm, swallowing valleys, climbing hillsides, reaching into the very depths of the earth until even the rivers hissed into vapor. The heat of it was so real, Amos felt his own breath shorten. Again, mercy erupted from his heart. "O Lord God, please stop. Jacob cannot endure this." But God was not lashing out. He was revealing the urgency of their condition, stripping away the nation's illusions of strength. Then a third vision emerged, quieter but more devastating than fire or locusts. A hand, God's own, lowering a plumb line over Israel. A simple tool of measurement, yet in divine hands it became a verdict. Israel's moral architecture was crooked, their foundation warped beyond repair, and the builder of all creation would no longer overlook the leaning of a collapsing wall. One by one, each vision peeled back the layers of the nation's pride, exposing a truth that temple songs and lavish sacrifices could no longer disguise. Israel had mistaken prosperity for alignment, ritual for righteousness, abundance for approval. And Amos, this shepherd from a forgotten village, now carried visions that struck at the very heart of their delusion. His message was no longer merely spoken. It radiated with the weight of heaven itself. And the more clearly he spoke, the more the powerful began to feel the blade of truth press against everything they were desperate to protect. Among all those unsettled by Amos's relentless voice, none felt the threat more sharply than Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, a man whose position depended on preserving the illusion that everything in Israel was spiritually sound. Bethel had long ceased to be a sanctuary of truth. Under Amaziah, it had become a stage where ritual masked corruption and where loyalty to the crown mattered more than loyalty to God. So when a weather-beaten shepherd from Judah stepped into that sacred stage and began dismantling the facade with nothing but uncompromising truth, Amaziah felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Amos wasn't speaking like the polished prophets who catered to kings. He exposed, confronted, and named the sins embedded in the nation's foundations, and the silent attention of the people made the threat all the more dangerous. Desperate to maintain control, Amaziah turned to politics, crafting a calculated warning for King Jeroboam. Amos is conspiring against you. The land cannot endure what he declares. He recast the prophet not as God's messenger, but as a southern agitator stirring rebellion. But neither intimidation nor slander moved Amos. He had no throne to impress, no crowd to please, no desire for influence, only obedience to the one who had summoned him. When political pressure failed, Amaziah confronted him personally, cloaking insult in courtesy as he told him, "Leave Seir, go back to Judah, earn your bread there. But do not speak in Bethel, this is the king's sanctuary." It was meant to humiliate him, to remind him he was an outsider with no authority or pedigree. Yet Amos answered with a quiet force that cut deeper than any accusation. He had never been a prophet by training or lineage, only a shepherd and fig tender until the Lord seized him from the fields and said, "Go, speak to my people Israel." His authority came from interruption, not institution, and no priest could revoke what heaven had initiated. The moment only intensified the hostility around him. Whispers multiplied. Some mocked him openly, others avoided meeting his gaze, while a few, though unwilling to admit it aloud, felt the unsettling truth in his words vibrating against their consciences. Still, Amos did not retreat. He stood in marketplaces drenched in vanity, in temples heavy with hollow devotion, in streets shaken by inequality, and spoke with the same fire that pulled him from the hills of Tekoa. His voice was not crafted to soothe, it was fashioned to strike. And with every word he released, the blade of divine truth drove deeper into the heart of a nation that had forgotten how to tremble. One day, amid the restless pulse of Samaria's markets, Amos fixed his eyes on the wealthy merchants weaving through the crowds like untouchable nobles. Their garments shimmered with dyes worth more than a laborer's lifetime wages, their sandals spotless despite the dust that clung to everyone else's feet, their laughter dripping with the blindness of excess. Watching them glide effortlessly through streets lined with the struggling and the starving. Amos felt that familiar fire surge again, part righteous fury, part grief. Without hesitation, he raised his voice, his words slicing through the clamor like a blade. "You cows of Bashan." The insult cracked the air with shocking force. It was not cruelty, but divine exposure. He likened them to the pampered cattle of Bashan, creatures swollen with luxury and indulgence, oblivious to everything beyond their own comfort. And Amos pressed further, describing with stark precision the economic rot infecting the nation, merchants rigging their scales to cheat buyers, raising prices while cutting product, selling the leftovers of wheat, the dusty, worthless sweepings as if they were worthy food. The poor were not just neglected, they were exploited systematically. Their poverty turned into a profitable enterprise. Then Amos turned his voice toward the temples, toward Bethel and Gilgal, places wrapped in incense smoke and ceremonial spectacle. What he saw was not worship but performance. He condemned the festivals, the offerings, the elaborate assemblies, calling them a stench before God. Songs and sacrifices meant nothing when the same hands lifted in praise were the ones crushing the needy. Ritual could not camouflage corruption. And then came the line destined to echo through centuries: "Let justice roll down like a river, and righteousness like a never-failing stream." It wasn't a poetic flourish. It was a vision of what true devotion looked like: justice in motion, truth that flowed relentlessly, washing away the veneer of religiosity. A hush dropped over the crowd, heavy and electric. Some scoffed, some shifted uneasily. Others whispered nervously to their companions. Merchants clutched their cloaks. Priests exchanged wary looks. Amos's words were not just heard, they were felt, like a pressure against the chest. They were unbearable, not because they were outrageous, but because they were undeniable. And still he spoke, not from rage, but from obedience, knowing that even the harshest warning carried an invitation. Beneath every pronouncement of judgment lay the same quiet truth. If the people would turn, restoration was still possible, for God never exposes without offering a way back. In the heart of his relentless storm of warnings, while visions of fire, famine, and collapse still echoed through the streets of Samaria, Amos's voice began to shift. The sharp edge that had sliced through the nation's illusions softened, not in weakness, but in a different kind of strength. It was subtle at first, like the faint glow of a lantern appearing in a night so thick it seemed impossible for light to exist. Yet it grew, steady and deliberate. In the midst of judgment, Amos began to speak of restoration. In that day, he announced, "I will raise up the fallen shelter of David." To the people listening, the name David stirred something deep and almost forgotten, a memory of unity, humility, and a kingdom built not on spectacle but on devotion. The tent he mentioned was not about stone or architecture, it was the symbol of a relationship, the simple dwelling where God's presence rested among his people. What Amos described was not just rebuilding, but realigning God, restoring a heart posture that had long been lost. Then the imagery shifted again, blooming with impossible abundance. He spoke of vineyards so fruitful that harvesters would still be gathering grapes when it was already time to plow the ground again, of mountains dripping with new wine, of fields overflowing, blurring the line between planting and reaping because blessing would outrun time itself. Hunger, drought, and despair, the cycles that had shaped their suffering, would be shattered, and in their place, an unending season of provision. But the vision extended far beyond the soil. Amos saw exiles returning, sons and daughters who had been scattered, wounded, and forgotten. He saw ruined cities rising again, gardens being planted, homes filled with laughter instead of grief. Families would dwell in safety. Identity would be restored. A people who once felt abandoned would find themselves embraced again by the God they had forsaken. It was a message so bright it bordered on impossible. How could such renewal emerge from a nation teetering on the brink of devastation? How could joy bloom in soil cracked by injustice? But Amos did not speak hope as a distraction. He did not soften the blow of judgment. His hope was a seed, a defiant declaration that even the hardest earth can break open when heaven sends rain. And as he delivered these promises, a new tension spread around him. Anger no longer roared. It grew quieter, colder. The powerful exchanged looks that carried calculation. The crowds whispered in tones laced with confusion and suspicion. Resistance sharpened, but beneath it all, Amos sensed something far more ominous than hostility silence. A spiritual stillness so heavy it felt like the pause before a final verdict. Something in the atmosphere shifted. The threshold was near. His message had reached the edge of what the nation would tolerate. And still, he spoke on because the voice that summoned him had not fallen silent. After everything had been spoken, after the visions had torn through Israel's illusions, after judgment rumbled like distant thunder, after hope flickered faintly like a candle refusing to die, Amos began to step back from the center of the uproar. It wasn't defeat, it wasn't exhaustion, it was recognition. Something in him understood that the message was complete. The words entrusted to him had already taken flight. The fire he was commanded to ignite was burning on its own. What remained now belonged to the slow work of time, memory, and conviction. And so the prophet who once roared like a storm grew quiet, allowing silence to finish what speech had begun. It wasn't withdrawal, it was release. The streets where he had once stood so boldly now carried a residual tremor, as if the stones themselves still remembered the weight of his voice. Some people continued whispering about him, wrestling with fragments of his warnings, trying to untangle the strange mixture of doom and restoration he had spoken. His name drifted through Samaria like an unresolved question, uncomfortable, persistent. But among the powerful, the response hardened quickly. Mockery became their shield. Who was he, they scoffed, brushing him aside as a mere shepherd who had wandered too far from Judah's hills. A temporary disturbance, an untrained drifter, a prophet no one asked for and no one intended to heed. They believed dismissing him would neutralize him. But what they failed to grasp was that Amos's presence had never been the point. His voice may have faded from the marketplace, but the word he carried had not. It lingered, spreading quietly, seeping beneath the surface like an incoming tide. You could scoff at it, you could deny it, you could turn your back, but you could not stop it. The man had stepped out of view, but the message continued its slow, relentless walk through the land. The mystery surrounding Amos's final days only sharpens the weight of his story. One moment, his voice thundered across Israel. The next, he slipped from the record without ceremony or trace, dissolving into the same hills that had once shaped his solitude. There is no chronicle of his return, no inscription of his final breath. Perhaps he walked back to Tekoa in silence, slipping once more into the rhythms of herding sheep and slicing open sycamore figs beneath the sun. Perhaps he lived quietly, tending the land that had first trained his ears to hear God. Or perhaps he journeyed onward, carrying his message into nameless villages, speaking truth even when no one remained to listen or write. Whatever became of him, his disappearance was not an erasure. The silence that followed felt intentional, a divine pause. The stillness between revelation and reckoning. Heaven seemed to leave Israel alone with the echo of his warnings, a space where conscience could wrestle freely. The prophet vanished from sight, but his words did not. They moved through generations like a slow burning ember, igniting hearts long after the dust of Samaria settled. The strength of his message did not depend on his presence. It endured because truth, once spoken, has its own life. Though his contemporaries mocked him, His voice grew louder with time, carried on scrolls, recited in synagogues, and whispered through the callings of prophets who followed. His images, the plumb line, the river of justice, the pampered cattle of Bashan, became more than metaphors. They became lenses through which nations examined themselves, sparks that illuminated hypocrisy and demanded accountability. Kings died, priests faded, the wealthy vanished. But Amos's imagery remained etched into history, alive wherever justice is threatened. Amos left no royal line, earned no titles, and studied under no master. Yet he carved a legacy that outlasted empires. It was as though heaven deliberately chose a man without credentials to deliver a truth that credentialed men feared to speak. His courage grown in fields, refined in loneliness, unleashed in fire, became an inheritance the world could not bury. And perhaps the most haunting part of his legacy is the silence he left behind. For in that quiet, a question lingers not only for ancient Israel, but for anyone who encounters his words. What will you do when truth stops calling your name and instead waits for your answer? Amos reveals an unchanging truth. Genuine worship is never found in gold-plated rituals, in incense thick enough to cloud the air, or in songs sung so loudly that sincerity gets drowned in the noise. True devotion is recognized in the steady rhythm of righteousness justice that doesn't drip timidly when convenient, but surges forward like a river no one can dam. His message didn't rise from sanctuaries padded with privilege. It rose from open fields and crowded streets, from the margins where the bruised and voiceless lived. He stood for those forgotten by society and confronted those who benefited from their suffering. Speaking with a fire that scorched the complacent, his courage wasn't learned in halls of influence or granted by institutions. It was born from obedience. From the moment heaven interrupted an ordinary shepherd and said, "Go." He refused to dilute his message even when mocked, underestimated, or ignored, because the words he carried weren't his own. They were the weight of God's heart laid upon him. And that weight did not die with him. Even now, his legacy breathes through quiet acts of justice, in uncelebrated moments of integrity, in every soul that chooses truth over comfort. His voice still echoes in our resistance to systems that wound and exploit, reminding us that transformation rarely begins in palaces. It begins with someone humble, unseen, and willing. His life presses a question into our generation. Is the river of justice still moving through us, or have we tried to control what was meant to flow wild and free? Maybe even now, we too are being called into something uncomfortable, unpolished, yet undeniably holy, something that requires courage, not applause. And so Amos's story folds into our own, urging us to listen deeply, to act boldly, and to let righteousness roll through our lives like the river the prophet once summoned. The world still waits for that river to rise. Amos's story didn't conclude with triumphal songs or carved memorials. It slipped back into the quiet, just as it had emerged from it, yet the echo of his obedience continues to reverberate long after his footsteps vanished from the hills. He was nothing more than a shepherd, a man whose hands were roughened by bark and stone, whose life flowed to the rhythms of wind, earth, and patient labor. And still, this man of dust was entrusted with a message powerful enough to shake a kingdom to its core. His influence did not come from titles, clever speech, or institutional authority, but from the courage to obey what heaven whispered. That obedience, simple, unpolished, unpretentious, became the weight that made his life unforgettable. He stands as a reminder that when God seeks a messenger, he does not sift through credentials. He searches for a heart willing to be interrupted. From Tekoa's rugged hills to Samaria's crowded courts, Amos declared a truth that still slices through all pretense worship. Without justice, collapses into noise. Temples can gleam with gold, choirs can lift flawless harmonies. But if love for the least is missing, then heaven remains unmoved. What offering can please God when greed stains the hands that bring it? What hymn can rise when righteousness has been stifled? Amos's life was not an invitation to comfort, but to holy confrontation not born of rebellion, but of righteousness that refuses to look away. He exposed a religion that expected everything from God, yet gave nothing of integrity in return. And in doing so, he lifted the voices of the bruised and forgotten, bearing their anguish into the places where it had long been ignored. Even now, his cry burns across the ages. Turning away from injustice does not absolve us, it implicates us. His call for justice to surge like a river, and righteousness like a tireless stream, was not confined to his century. It is a summons for ours. It asks whether we are still willing to measure our lives against the plumb line of God's truth, whether we are shaping a world where holiness can dwell, or simply building something convenient for ourselves. Perhaps this is Amos's greatest legacy, the revelation that God can speak through anyone, anytime, anywhere, if the heart is surrendered enough to listen. And like him, we too can become a voice in places where silence has settled too deeply, vessels through which justice might rise again. The question that lingers is not whether heaven still calls, but whether we will answer, because it was one shepherd's trembling yes that once lit a revolution of truth, and another yes could do it again. The story of Amos doesn't fade into the past. It lingers like a question suspended above every generation that follows. Though his footsteps disappeared from the alleys of Samaria long ago, the gravity of his message has only intensified with time. He wasn't a scholar groomed in sacred halls, nor a polished prophet trained under temple masters. He was a man carved by the earth itself, with hands hardened by labor and a heart tempered by obedience. And yet, when he opened his mouth, heaven thundered and nations felt the tremble. What made Amos unforgettable wasn't prestige or eloquence. It was the uncompromising force of truth. In an age where truth is often diluted, reshaped, or ignored, his cry still reverberates like rolling thunder. Let justice surge like a mighty river, and righteousness like a stream that never runs dry. He didn't call people to perfection, he called them back into alignment. He revealed that the worth of worship isn't measured in ceremonies or performances, but in how we treat the unseen, the unheard, the unprotected. And that message, though ancient in origin, burns with urgency today. Injustice still parades through our world. Oppression has learned new disguises, and even faith can slip into performance if we stop paying attention. Amos doesn't just voice history, he exposes our present. His question becomes ours. Are we listening this time? These are days that require the same kind of courage, not the kind that seeks attention, but the kind that chooses faithfulness when no one is watching. Not the courage to debate, but the courage to live truth. You don't need a pulpit to be prophetic. Sometimes the loudest message is delivered through integrity, sacrifice, and the quiet decisions that shape who we become. That is the legacy Amos left us, proof that God often calls the unnoticed, the ordinary, the underestimated, that justice is not a trend but a commitment, and that sacred assignments often rise from overlooked places. If this story stirred something in you, pause for a moment like this video. Share it with someone who needs a reminder of truth. Subscribe for more prophetic storytelling, and tap the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. And tell me below, what part of Amos's journey awakened something in you? What injustice still needs your voice? Thank you for walking through this story with me. Thank you for lending your heart to a message that still speaks. And remember, your simple, trembling yes, like Amos's, may be the beginning of a ripple that outlasts your lifetime.